we go. All right, so today again we are talking about iridology. Yes, we do that every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, and soon that'll be Mountain Daylight Time. And today what we're talking about specifically is the different languages that are used for iridology. We're going to talk about the old language and the new language. We're going to talk about why the language is changing. We're going to talk about what the different language means. Hello, MSTE Banks. I wish I knew what that stood for so I could greet you more personally. It's good to have you with us on Instagram. I am just going to flip my phone around so you can see my screen on Instagram. It is good to have you with me. Thank you for being there. All right, so let's get started. All right. What we know is iridology has been evolving for nearly 200 years, right? And our understanding of iridology has undergone massive changes, and research has moved us forward. At least for those of us who've chosen to keep up with the times, it's moving forward. Somehow in that forward movement though, and hello Valerie, good to have you on Instagram with us. Somehow in that forward movement, some of the old language has persisted. And that old language is not where we want to be for a whole bunch of reasons. And because the old names are misleading and they actually reflect a significant lack of understanding for what we actually know about iridology. So this little tutorial today is about getting you current with the kinds of language that we're using now and why we use it. In the holistic world, unless you are a licensed medical doctor, you need to avoid diagnosing and prescribing. And that means that we need to avoid recommending therapies based on a disease name, because recommending therapies based on a disease name is a really error-ridden way to do things, because it means if you gave the disease the wrong name, then you're going to give the wrong treatment. Does that make sense? As we go through this, what you will notice is that the old language that we used to use 40 or 50 years ago, and I've been an iridologist for 40 years now, so I've seen this change and I've kept pace with it because it made sense. But that old language, the old words we used to use, very diagnostic in nature, and that's not what we want to be seeing. The new language instead is very descriptive, very descriptive. So just a little invitation for you here to go ahead and click through iridology.education. You're going to see a little pop-up come up on the screen. And in that screen, if you enter your details, your name and your email address, you are going to be given a constitutional iridology map that you can download. That will also mean that you're getting twice weekly emails from me that will keep you apprised of what our little free training sessions are, like the one we're doing today, right? It'll also let you know when the next iridology course is coming up. Let's dive into this, okay? Wanda, hello, thank you for joining us on Instagram. Let's start with the very first word. This one is the one that probably drives me the craziest. And for those of you who are with me on the live webinar, I keep looking away from the camera, and that simply is I'm monitoring platforms on different technology pieces here. So I'm not trying to be rude, but I do need to make sure I keep track of everybody, right? All right, so here we go. The first one, how many of you have heard the word lesion? Would you raise your hand if you're on Instagram or if you're on Facebook? Let me know that you've heard the word lesion before. Okay, so while you're doing that, let's dive into this. The definition of lesion is a region or organ or tissue which has suffered damage through injury or disease, such as a wound, ulcer, abscess, or tumor. Right now, the up-to-date understanding of a lesion, which would be this kind of typically a petal shape or a leaf-shaped thing in the eye, the up-to-date understanding is that the lay of the iris fiber does not change as a result of trauma. So what we mean by that is in old school iridology, they would teach that this would show up if there'd been trauma to the body, and that it would disappear, or that lines would form inside it like this when healing was happening. Now, if you were with me on Friday, we did a complete case study on this. Wanda, thank you for weighing in that you know what lesion, that you've heard the word lesion before. On Friday, we did a complete Facebook Live, webinar, Instagram Live on this topic, where I showed with x-rays and surgical scars and concurrent eye photos that this doesn't happen. And we know now, not just from what I shared on Friday, but we know it's been proven that this is not transient. The fiber structure of the eye does not change. And because the fiber structure of the eye does not change, this is not going away. This is an inherent marking. It shows us inherent potentials. As such, we now use a new name called lacuna. So a lacuna brings our attention to this area, but it doesn't tell us what is inherently wrong there. That's really important to remember. It does not tell us what's inherently wrong there, but it tells us that we need to ask questions. We need to gain a deeper understanding by having that conversation with our client. So lesion versus lacuna. Lesion is out, lacuna is in. We also used to have this thing called a sodium ring or a cholesterol ring, and we now call it a lipemic diathesis. The reason we do this is we're talking about this ring coming around here, and it used to be believed that this had a really high correlation, and it does have some correlation to the presence of hardening of the arteries and senility and elevated cholesterol, things like that. But it's not a super strong correlation. What we now know is that this actually has a stronger correlation to how the body manages its carbs and its fats. All right, so when we look at this, the new name of lipemic diathesis, and there's a few other names that we can use to break this down a little bit further. We might call it a corneal arcus if this white milky film is only at a part of the perimeter of the iris. We might call it a corneal annulus if it goes all the way around like this one does. We can describe it in general terms as a corneal opacity. So just that the cornea is getting more opaque in certain areas. But again, this doesn't tell us that the person has elevated cholesterol. It doesn't tell us they absolutely have hardening of the arteries. It tells us that there is likely an issue with how they process their carbs. And you know that a malproduction, no, that was the wrong way to describe that. When you process your carbs incorrectly, it can lead to cholesterol issues, right? And so if we see this starting to form, the person may not yet have clinical cholesterol issues, but if we see that little edge starting to form, we know we want to then be working with this person and how they process their carbs to make sure that they're not going into a cholesterol situation. Now, we need cholesterol, right? So it's not, the problem isn't do we have cholesterol, because we need cholesterol. We need to make sure that we are handling the carbs properly so we're not ending up with an imbalance between our LDLs and HDLs, right? We need to make sure we're keeping the triglycerides in check. And this is all an indication that this person may have problems doing that. Now, have I seen people with this marking have elevated cholesterol? Absolutely, I have. But I've also seen people with this marking not have elevated cholesterol. Now, why in the heck would that be? That would be because sometimes, depending on the age at which we see this starting to form, sometimes it has nothing to do with cholesterol. Sometimes it has nothing to do with how the person handles their carbs. Sometimes it's just the cornea aging. So we don't want to use the term sodium ring, cholesterol ring. We just want to use lipemic diathesis. Hello, the Fit Bar. Thanks for joining us. Good to see you there on Instagram. The nerve or stress rings, right? So we've got these rings coming around that we used to call nerve rings or stress rings. We used to think we could get rid of these. They are not the result of stress. They won't go away when the stress goes away. You cannot erase them. They are an indicator that this person tends to always be ready for the next crisis. They tend to live in the sympathetic nervous system response field. Liviora says, is corneal arcus fully formed and corneal partially formed? So when we talk about an arcus, or let's flip back one. When we talk about a corneal arcus, it would be partial. When we talk about a corneal annulus, it would be complete. Lipemic diathesis encompasses both. So you have lipemic diathesis that can break down into a corneal arcus or a corneal annulus. Arcus is partial, annulus is complete. The arcus may become an annulus. Did that answer your question for you, Liviora? Let me know. So when we come back to our nerve rings and our stress rings, these rings, again, teach us that this person is inherently programmed. You're very welcome. I'm glad that answered your question, Liviora. And I hope I'm saying that right. But these nerve rings and contraction furrows, again, tell us that this person is inherently programmed from the moment of conception to be a little more reactive when it comes to stress. So I lovingly say that these people are drama queens, right? That means that if there's a reason to get upset or frustrated or angry or anything like that, they're going to find it. They are just going to find it. And so when we see that, when we see this, we know that this person does need help staying in the here and the now and needs help learning stress management skills. But as they learn those skills, this is not going to go away. Simply not going to go away. All right, so as we see this, it simply tells us that we've got someone that we need to nourish properly to support their nervous system. We used to say 3 complete rings meant this person was headed for a nervous breakdown. We now know that is not true. We know that these look darker and deeper when the pupil is larger, and they look shallower and lighter when the pupil is smaller. It used to be that people said that dark and deep was chronic and blah, 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 right? And then they would show before and after pictures, and the before picture had a huge pupil with really deep looking contraction furrows, and the after picture had a small pupil with really shallow looking contraction furrows. The only thing that made the difference between deep and shallow, darker and lighter was the size of the pupil, right? That's what changes that appearance. So again, these rings are much more apparent when the pupil is very large. They are much less apparent when the pupil is very small. We do want to nourish these people with good quality nervines and B vitamins. Here we have venous congestion versus a circulatory ring. Now, I'm hoping that this shows up really well for you on Instagram. When we look at this, can you see that there's a little bit of a purplish, sometimes it's bluish, on some eyes, haze hanging off the edge of the iris here, and a whole lot more down here. This is what used to be called venous congestion. We now call it a circulatory ring because it doesn't always suggest that the circulation is totally sluggish. I actually, in my practice, see a stronger correlation between this and blood sugar imbalances and tired adrenals. And when we look at that, blood sugar imbalances do impact circulation. And so, but when I see this, I always want to ask those questions. Are you a carb addict? Do you like your sweet things? And people will say, no, I eat fruit. Not how many pieces of fruit? 7 pieces of fruit a day. That is a carb addict. You're just not getting it from table sugar. You're getting it from your fruit, right? And that can compromise circulation, as can tired adrenal glands. So again, we want to call that a circulatory ring, not venous congestion. Oh, this is a real bugaboo for me. These things. These dark lines radiating outwards. They used to be called parasite lines. We now call them radial furrows. When we do this, when we talk about these, the only things we see in an iris are things that are inherent, as in there is a genetic predisposition. We see that these people have inherited this ability. They've inherited this weak link. They've inherited this trait. All right. Parasites don't change your genetic structure. If you have a parasite in your gut, you don't pass that on to your children when they are conceived. Right. And so when we see this, parasites cannot change what your eyes look like, unless it's one of those parasites that's actually in the eyeball, but it's not changing the lay of the fiber of the iris. That would be changing the sclera, and you'd see that squiggly thing. And I've seen pictures of those kinds of parasites. They're really gross. So again, the iris can only teach us about inherent potentials. They can't teach us about things that are not a part of our DNA. So when we see radial furrows, which is a much more apt name, what these are showing us is that inherently the fiber structure of the iris, there's a separation in the layer of the fibers, and we're looking down into that gap. We're looking into that space between the fibers. What does this show us? This type of separation shows us that there is potentially an interruption, an inherently programmed interruption in nerve feed. It tells us that this can become a holding tank for garbage, where metabolic waste gets stored there and doesn't get moved out. But it doesn't tell us that there are definitely parasites in there at all. So we cannot call these parasite lines. We need to call them radial furrows. You will see a lot of people talking about drug spots, or psora, as they're sometimes called. In constitutional iridology, we just simply call this pigment. North Americans are cleanse happy. I don't know if you've noticed that. It seems to be a huge badge of honor to announce that one is full of toxins and is doing a cleanse. How much smarter would it be to just make the necessary lifestyle changes and to not put trash in your body, to help your body break your foods down properly so that you don't get a lot of metabolic waste, to help your body just on a daily basis clean out the metabolic debris and never have to do a cleanse again. Now, having said that, there is no scientific proof that these areas of pigment that we see here actually are the result of chemicals or of drug use or exposure to toxins. There is no proof that these marks can be cleansed out, although I've got a ton of proof that shows pigment accumulating in the eye, even in people who have a clean diet, who have never used drugs, who just, they're really on top of their game. Yet we sometimes see these pigments accumulate. And that is an inherent predisposition again, where the body is programmed for this pigment to appear in the eye to warn us that an organ may be inherently programmed to have a problem. So you go, but that doesn't make sense. And yes, it does, because I want you to think, if you're a woman, this will make more sense to you. You get these little crow's feet, right, beside our eyes, and we get the laugh lines and things like that. Some of that is because we like to smile. Some of it is inherently programmed, right? My hair started to go gray about 5 years ago. And, that was an inherent programming. That is exactly what these spots are like. They are inherently programmed. So again, we do know that the pigment may appear over time And it may suggest that two things. The color of the pigment teaches us which organ is likely the source of the imbalance, which organ is struggling in and of itself. The placement of the pigment teaches us which other organs are likely to suffer because the first organ was out of balance. So a pigment always gives us two pieces of information: the source of the problem and the destination for the problem. An absorption ring versus a gray interpupillary border. Now this again might be a little harder for those of you who are on Instagram. I hope you can see this, that at the very inner edge here, there is a gray edge that has a little zigzaggy edge to it before we get into the iris. This gray edge used to be called an absorption ring. We now call it a gray interpupillary border because this actually doesn't teach us about the body's ability to absorb things. It teaches us about the inherent integrity of the stomach lining. It teaches us about that body's inherent ability to secrete the digestive juices that handle protein digestion. Okay, so it's not an absorption ring. We should really call it more of a digestion ring, but we don't. It's a gray interpupillary border. Remember at the beginning I said that what we're really doing here is using language that is more descriptive of what we see in the iris and not diagnostic. This is an important thing. This is actually, calling it a gray interpupillary border is actually the correct ophthalmological name for what we are looking at. Way back when, we used to call this a rheumatic eye, where the eye was a blue eye and everything in it was white and fairly bright white. And so when we see that, again, it used to be called a rheumatic eye. Now we call it a febrile eye. Rheumatic eye, isn't that just a name that makes you want to just cringe? Doesn't it make you think that this person probably has rheumatoid arthritis? Right? And you just don't want to be putting those kinds of thoughts in anybody's head. The febrile eye is usually found in someone who fevered easily as a child and may still be prone to fevering as their first line of immune defense as an adult. Now, doesn't that make sense? When you look at this and you see this and you say, do you have a history of fevering as a child? Is fever still one of the ways that you know you're getting sick? And they go, yeah. Well, suddenly you've got that insight. And when you understand the usefulness of a fever, the role of a fever, the dietary things you want to do to help the fever do its job, then this eye makes complete and total sense. Oh, this is another one that just breaks my heart. We used to call this a weak constitution. And that was because, you know, we looked at the fiber structure and it's all loosey-goosey and there's gaps and patches and areas that are shaded and places where fiber is just missing. And we used to call it a weak constitution. Now, how would that make your day to have someone say, you've got a weak constitution? Oh my goodness. In reality, whether your fibers are densely packed and fairly straight or wavy and woven and gappy shows your predisposition, not your actual condition. I've worked with clients who had a so-called weak constitution. We call them now connective tissue subtype, but they displayed no weakness at all. How could that be? It was simply because they had already learned what their bodies needed in order to function really well and to do really well. Okay, so in the modern constitutional iridology, we call this the connective tissue subtype. Their nutrition likely just simply needs to be way more on track. They've got a little less leeway for messing around with their diet. They need to learn the rules of health for their body early on, and they need to abide by those, and then they're fine. They just have less leeway, like I said, for messing around with their diet and with their lifestyle. The strong constitution. Now, the strong constitution, again, from the old language, would have shown up as very densely packed, neatly organized fiber structure. Now, we would call this as an eye that has a good resiliency, that it's very resilient, which means that when they've got a health issue, if we give them the right support, the right nutrients, the right supplements, the right lifestyle changes, their health will bounce back very quickly. We no longer call this a strong constitution. Now we call it the neurogenic subtype, because while this person's body responds quickly to things, we also know that they tend to be a little bit sensitive on that stress/emotional side of things. And so when we see this, again, this person, because they've got that better fiber structure, they've got that fiber structure that says they respond quickly to the right things, but they can also, their body can put up with a lot of garbage. So these people often don't learn the rules of their own health at a young age. They often party hard, forget their sleep, they don't eat well because they can get by without it. But when they do that for a long time, like into their 40s and 50s, that's when they come in. And they'll say to me things like, I've never been sick a day in my life. What the heck is going on? I look at their eyes. We talk about how they've lived their life up to this point in time. And it's like, well, that's it. Your body will not forgive you forever. You do have to do some nice things for it. This really strong fiber structure can collapse their health. Their eye structure is not going to change, but they can collapse their health by not doing the right kinds of things. So we need to actually help them get it all in line. Now, some of the things that these people have challenges with is they like to be in control. They like everything to be just so. All their ducks have to be lined up in a row. All the spices in the kitchen have to be in alphabetical order. Everything needs to be just so. And they crave peace and calm. All right. Next one, bowel pockets versus crypts. Bowel pockets versus crypts. As a holistic practitioner, I have no way to look inside a person's body, and I cannot confirm the presence of bowel pockets or diverticuli, as the medical world would like to call them. When we look at this iris, we see some very tiny, very dark, diamond-shaped or teardrop-shaped lacunae attached to the collarette, and they can be inside or outside the collarette. And what these suggest isn't that this person necessarily has a diverticulum. It suggests that there may be a weakness, an insufficiency, or an inefficiency in that part of the intestinal tract, and whether it's inside its intestinal tract, outside its nutrient transportation. And when we see these, we know that it probably makes it harder for the body to offload toxins and to utilize nutrients. So we need to ask questions. Again, with constitutional iridology, a big difference between old style and new style iridology is the old told you what was wrong. The new assesses the eyes and uses the eyes to guide us in the kinds of questions we want to ask our client to get the information we need to be the most helpful to them. The autonomic nerve wreath, which we now call the collarette, because this autonomic nerve wreath or collarette gives us so much more information than just about the nervous system. It does teach us about the autonomic nervous system. It teaches us about the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems in particular. It also teaches us about the inherent tone of the intestinal tract. And if it is pigmented, we gain insight as to how those organs and tissues are being affected by other organs and tissues, right? So this collarette gives us insight even into personality, whether we're looking at someone who's an introvert or an extrovert or just all kinds of things. Someone's got a bit of a temper, someone likes things just nice and even and calm. So we don't call it the autonomic nerve wreath anymore. We call it the collarette. The lymphatic rosary is now described as the hydrogenoid subtype. So those of you who know what the lymphatic rosary is, it's this ring of dots coming around the edge. And, you know, some people when we look at this and we call it lymphatic rosary, they talk about it being the lymphatic system. Well, this also talks about surface circulation in the body, not just lymphatics, but blood. It also teaches us about whether the lymphatic system is able to flush properly, whether the circulation is able to move properly, and all that kind of stuff. So when we see this, it does suggest that the lymphatic system and the circulation system at the surface of the body may be a little bit sluggish, but it's not a guarantee. If this person is doing the kinds of things they need to do to take care of their lymphatic system, to take care of their circulatory system, these inherent markings are just there as a reminder that the body could go into a struggling situation with these areas. Does that all make sense? Alrighty, so with that, that's our foray into old and new for languaging and the reason why the language is changing, especially in constitutional iridology. And I just wanted to invite you to a webinar that is happening Thursday, March 12th. In that webinar, I'm going to introduce the upcoming course, Confident Nutritionist Dynamic Iridology, which is an online taught by live webinar program, 40 hours long, so it's 20 weeks, 2 hours per week, teaching all of the iridology content that a person needs in order to prepare to certify with the International Iridology Practitioners Association, if they should so choose. If you would like to register for that webinar, hop on over to iridology.education/webinar, enter your details, and that will put you in the loop to receive notifications for the webinar to remind you to show up, as well as the information, the bi-weekly emails that I send out that announce these little training sessions that I do. So with that, my friends, thank you so much for being with me. I've had a ton of fun, and I look forward to seeing you again on Friday when we do this at the same time, but with a different topic. Look forward to seeing you then. Have a marvelous week till then. Bye for now.